Hey folks, Andy here. Hope you're well. Hope you're surviving whatever the gods and the Met Office are throwing at you. Right, just recently I started playing with a cleaner guitar sound than I've been used to doing for quite a lot of years. I watched a Brett Papa video and it kind of really motivated me to just give it a go, just to wind everything down beyond what I previously thought of as edge of breakup sounds and just see what I could do with it. And it was absolutely dreadful. I kind of gritted my teeth, stuck on with it, but what I found was that everything was just a little bit hard and a little bit plinky. Now, when I'm noodling around or when I'm just practicing here, I prefer to fire up an amp and actually listen through the guitar speakers. I know there are a whole bunch of ways that you can bring down the volume levels of tube amps to get them to the point where they're actually cooking, where they're doing what they're meant to. And I've got a whole series of videos called Tube Taming about exactly that. But when I'm just noodling, I prefer to plug in and just hear the sound coming out of guitar speaker. So I've got this sound and it's just a little bit clinky, a little bit sort of thin sounding. And I thought, I don't want to aim to work with less gain and then add an overdrive pedal. That just defeats the object completely. So I thought if I put a boost in front, it's going to drive the level going into the amp, overdrive the input of the amp. And again, I've got more gain, more distortion in there. So I thought, what about a compressor? Now, I haven't used a compressor since the days of the good old Boss CS1, maybe, the Compression Sustainer 1, or maybe the 2. But certainly back in the day, I was running this into a Marshall when we could crank a Marshall, but into a Marshall with a super overdrive in front of it. And it really didn't work that well. We all kind of tried this stuff with the promise that we would get endless sustain, just like having an amp turned up to 11. And it didn't work. It just turned into a horrible squishy mess. And I sold the pedal and moved on and never really thought about comps again. So when it came time to say, I'm going to go out and buy a compressor, I did what any sane person would do. I went straight onto YouTube and did a search on guitar compressor pedals, and I found loads and loads of videos, and some of them were very useful, but an awful lot of them, even from people who clearly know what they're doing with compressors, have information in that's a little bit misleading. Now, I'm used to using studio compression. I use studio compressors all the time, and I think I know how a compressor works. But I did find that when I started trying to dial this thing in, it took me a while to get my head around the effect that it was actually having on my guitar signal. And watching a bunch of these videos, I can see where the descriptions kind of match what's happening, but don't describe what's actually really happening to your signal when it goes through a compressor. So I thought, why not just make a little video and kind of cover off the reality of what these things do. But instead of just talking about it, I'm going to fire up a Cubase session. I'm going to use a studio compressor plugin and some test signals and show you what they actually really do, despite what most of us think they do. Okay, so just about every description of what a compressor does tells us that it reduces the dynamic range of the audio, that it turns down the loudest parts and turns up the quieter parts. And the general concept is that you have a signal that's bumbling along. Somewhere in there you have got a threshold, which is this line here, and when the signal goes above that threshold, it gets turned down, and it gets turned down according to a ratio, which could be 2:1, 3:1, 4:1, 7:1, whatever. Your compressor may have a control that allows you to adjust the threshold, or it may have a fixed threshold and you just turn up or down the signal going into it. It may have a control that allows you to adjust the ratio, or it may have a fixed ratio. Right, let's have a look at what is actually happening when we do this. So this is a Cubase project, and what I have got set up here is a test signal, nice simple sine wave. We could use a real signal, which may look a bit more like this. But as you can see, it's quite difficult. This is a single electric guitar, and it's kind of quite difficult to really see what's going on with that. So we're going to save that for the moment, and we're going to go with our test signal. And up here I have a compressor. This is just a standard Cubase compressor plugin, but it does basically the same sort of job that your pedals, your rack mount units and so on do. The one thing about this is that it is just the standard vanilla DAW plugin. It doesn't claim to add any character, it just does the job of compressing. So I'll take it out of bypass. You see our signal here, I've got a 4:1 ratio dialed in, and as I lower the threshold, well, the threshold's higher than the signal level, nothing's happening, nothing's happening. And then as my threshold comes down to where the signal is, you can see it is turning down the whole of the signal. it's not just turning down the top bit of the signal like that. You see it's turning down everything. If you look at the angle of these lines where they cross the 0 line, look at the angle of the waveform, it's turning down all the way down to nothing. So when any of the signal goes above the threshold, or when the threshold comes down below the level of any of the signal, the whole thing is getting turned down, and it's getting turned down by the amount that we see here. Now, there is a way that we can change the shape, and that's called clipping. Now, if I turn off my compressor and bring this, which is a clipper, into play, so the clipper adds gain, so this will change shape and size a little bit. But you see, as I increase the drive on the clipper, first of all, it's making the level of the signal bigger until it starts to run into the threshold on the clipper. And then you can see it's actually distorting. You would not kid yourself that that waveform is the same as that waveform. Clipped waveform, non-clipped waveform. And if you did think that it was the same, if we just go to a different type of clipping, there you go. We're not going to kid ourselves on there. Clipped waveform, unclipped waveform, clipped, unclipped. But if we bring in our compressor and bring it down, it is the same shape. Okay, that's the first thing about what compressors do. The second thing is we hear that a compressor will turn up the level of low-level signals. And whilst there are compressors that do that, it's not what usually happens. What usually happens is we apply compression, which makes the signal smaller, and then we apply makeup gain, which makes the whole signal bigger. And the funny old thing is that if we apply 2 dB of compression there, if I apply 2 dB of gain after that, it reinflates. If I bypass the compressor, you can see it looks exactly the same there. And that is because I am turning down the whole signal with my compressor, and then I am turning up the whole signal with my makeup gain. Now, there are things that do this differently. There is a plugin which I will show you called MV2. Now, this is a Waves plugin, and it's really quite famous because this is a true downward and upward compressor. So if I turn off my test signal and go back to playing a bit of music, I can compress downwards. And you can see how that level is reacting to the music. I can then compress upwards. And you see that we have not got just a steady upward gain, we've got a gain that's actually reacting to the lower threshold of the music. So sometimes we're going to use a compressor to change the sound. We want to make things sound more powerful, we want to make them punch more, we want to do all sorts of fancy things. But sometimes all we want to do is actually control level. And when we're doing this, something like MV2 allows us to control the loud parts. It enables us to bring up the level of the quiet parts so we can hear them. But it also means that we can leave the majority of the signal in the middle uncompressed. And when you're dealing with a very natural sounding source, that is a very good trick to be able to do. So this is true upward and downward compression, as against this one, which is applying downward compression and makeup gain, where the makeup gain applies to everything. Okay, the next thing that we're going to have a look at is attack and release. And this is another one of those things that can be a little bit misleading. The general impression that we get of what attack and release is about is this. We have an attack time, and that is typically going to be measured in something like milliseconds. So attack time in milliseconds. We take it up there to the side chain, crosses the threshold, and then it's generally described as being the attack time is the amount of time it takes for the compressor to react to the signal, which suggests that we cross the threshold and then our signal keeps on going absolutely fine until it reaches the attack time, and then our ratio of whatever it is comes in and the compression starts. What actually happens is we have our attack time, and if we have our ratio of 2 to 1, divide that in half. From the moment when we cross the threshold, it takes the amount of the attack time to get usually from no compression to 2 to 1. So there it's 1 to 1, there it's 2 to 1, and then we're going to compress on from there. Now this could be any sort of different shape of curve. It's part of the character that goes into a lot of compressors. I'll just throw in here that you get sometimes a button or a dial which dials in the degree of hardness of the knee. A hard knee, a true hard knee compressor, the signal is unchanged until it hits the threshold. On a soft knee compressor, what we're going to do is we're actually going to start, it's like having an extended attack time with a gentle curve. So we're going to start just applying a little bit of compression at some point before we get up to the threshold, and then carry on like that. And this is good if you want to hear a very gentle, or you want to not hear a very gentle transition into compression. So does this stuff really matter? When you've got something with a nice gentle slope to it like this, no. But just imagine if you had something like this. Say you've got a snare hit or a guitar power chord that's got a big transient peak. And let's just say that you've got an attack time like this, attack in milliseconds. If this compressor works on the basis that we first talked about, where it does nothing until you've hit the attack time, you pass the threshold there, and before you actually start to do any compression, your whole transient peak has hit, it's fallen back below the threshold, and your signal's just carrying on. If you do this the way we talked about actually doing it, you're starting to get compression arriving here. So these peaks are getting turned down. This, I think, is one of the misunderstandings that makes setting up compressors so difficult. So when it might matter is in a case like this. I've got my very percussive guitar bits, and you can see I have got transient peaks in there. They're jumping about a bit, but you can see the odd sort of high peak when it hits. And I can bring in my compression, start to bring that down. I'm going to go to a high ratio, and you see we're flattening down. We've still got some tiny little hint of peaks in there. If I extend my attack time out, then the compressor is working more slowly. It's taking longer to ramp up to that high ratio. You can still see my peaks in there, and you can hear the effect that the compression is having. Now that's on the longest 100 millisecond setting for the attack time, and it's still squashing those transients down. Right, what I'm now going to do is this. I am going to fire up a duplicate of my signal that's running 100 milliseconds later on another track, and I am going to go in and set my compressor to work off the signal from the other track. So we are now getting the side chain for the compressor keyed off a track that's running 100 seconds later. So this is the equivalent of having an attack time where literally the compressor does nothing for 100 milliseconds. So turn that down to the quickest attack. You see and hear the transients in there. They are big and they are crystal clear, versus running off the signal itself with 100 milliseconds attack time. You can see they are much more subdued. And what that is telling us is that even on the 100 millisecond attack time, we are starting to clamp down on those transients. Immediately they go above the threshold, as against doing nothing for 100 milliseconds after the peak hits. So there you go. In a nutshell, that is what compressors do. Is this stuff just being really picky? Yeah, absolutely it is. The ideal answer, I think, would be to take your compressor, play with the controls, get the sound that you like, and then put it on one side and get on with making music. The trouble is, though, it's generally held that compressors are the guitar effects that are the most difficult to dial in. It's generally held that in the worlds of recording and mixing music, compression is the thing that trips up beginners more often and for longer than just about anything else. And the reason is that compression effects can be quite hard to hear. Until you get your ears dialed into it, it's very hard to really tell what's going on just by listening. Yep, you can set the controls to really squash your audio down, you can hear that, but generally that's not very musical. You end up trying to back it off. You can't quite hear what's going on, so you end up falling back on your sort of intellectual knowledge of what a compressor's doing. And if the picture that you have of what it's doing is very slightly different to what it is, you can end up chasing your tail round and round and wasting so much time. And let's be clear, most of the time, we don't choose compressors just because they reduce dynamic range. Most of the time, they do other things as well. They add harmonic distortion in a lot of cases. They have very non-linear attack and release curves. And whilst it's hard to describe in words what that does to the sound, when we hear something that we like, we really love it. Check out an opto compressor. Those things are so far from textbook, but they tend to sound so absolutely wonderful that most of us just love them anyway. The choices that we make when we're making a compressor very often come down to what flavour of other stuff we want to sprinkle on our music. But the basic blocks that go into setting the thing up are always going to be what we've talked about in this video. Now, I know I do get that I haven't talked about where to set the knobs and what sort of settings and what type of compressors are better for different things. We can cover that off another time. But whatever compressor you have, be it a plug-in or rack mount unit, be it a pedal, from the most expensive to the simplest, what's in this video is what your compressor is going to be doing. And if you get these mental pictures clear as you're working with it, you should be able to start to tabulate in your mind what you're hearing versus what the controls are doing and build up your own picture of what you want compression to be. I do hope this stuff is useful. If it is, maybe give us a thumbs up. That's really appreciated. Hit the little bell so you get notified when new content comes out. The important one, please hit the subscribe button. It makes a massive difference to the channel. If you've got any questions, stick them down below. I'll be delighted to have a go at answering them. Until the next time then, look after yourselves. I'm Andy Picker, and we'll see you then. Bye for now.